Hello, my name is Erica Minchella, and I am a real estate attorney handling both transactions and litigation. And most recently, the work that I am focused on is helping both landlords and tenants deal with what will happen for lease negotiations with businesses shut down uh, due to COVID-19 from the middle of March to whenever that ends, having no revenue and not being able to generate the funds for payment of rent. I have a number of ideas as to what will help either side, and I'm going to talk to you about that today. First of all, I'm going to tell you that I don't have a magic wand, and a lot of the suggestions I'm going to make are very logical, and hopefully this will just help piece together some ideas for you, whichever side you wind up with on negotiations. The first thing I would suggest is that open and honest communications are going to be critical for both sides. The more that parties can talk about how to address this problem that neither side created, the better negotiations will be and people will be able to come to better solutions. I think one of the first things that you need to look at is what is the pain point for each party. For the tenant who has not been able to operate their business, again, through no fault of their own, how are they going to be able to regenerate that revenue? And if the business isn't going to be able to be fully operational until May, June, July, how will future rent payments be dealt with? For the landlord, mortgage payments are going to be needed to be paid unless there are some adjustments with regards to what their lender will do. We have heard recently that the new real estate tax bills that will come out in July, payable by August 1st, are not going to be deferred most likely because the county is desperate for those revenues, having spent an inordinate amount of money on health care. So the fact that landlords are going to have to be paying certain expenses, notwithstanding the fact that they're not getting rent, is going to be critical. So how do we adjust for each of those sides? First of all, I think that both parties should be looking at what the CAM, the common area maintenance expenses, the real estate expenses are going to be, and see if those can be addressed at least minimally at this point. To the extent that a landlord can work to defray some of their costs, maybe reducing the amount of maintenance that needs to be done because there's no business being operated at that time, or working with their mortgage companies, lenders, to defer mortgage payments for a period of time, that's probably going to be helpful on both sides. For both parties, looking at the deferral of rent payments, spreading them out over longer periods of time, spreading them out over the length of the um, balance of the lease, or possibly looking at a renegotiation of the lease. This may be a time when the landlord and tenant want to discuss a new lease, an extension of the lease, because it may help to defray the amounts that are going to be unpaid for whatever period of time, and still be allowed to give the landlord a long-term tenant. It may not be that anyone knows enough, has a crystal ball enough to know when the tenant will go back into business, but if they do have the kind of business that will rebound once the lockdown is lifted, it may be a good time to discuss such things as a lengthening of the lease. On the contrary, or on the other hand, it may be a good time to talk about taking on smaller space and allowing some of the space to be rented to another tenant, and making the space more affordable to the tenant and creating a sense of security for the landlord that they're going to be able to get the rent that they need. Another option is to look at whether the space is easily subleased, whether it is viable space for another purpose, for another tenant, and it's a good time for the parties to agree that they should split from the relationship that they have with each other. Another alternative is to see if the tenant has the ability to buy out the lease, make a payment, cover the landlord's expenses for a period of time, and agree that they will no longer be held liable for that space, and the landlord will be able to move on and go and get another tenant, the costs of the downtime being covered by the tenant. One thing that both landlords and tenants need to look at is that space requirements are going to be very different after this point in time. Many uh, spaces that are available for offices are really not going to be needed on the extent that they are, because people will have learned that they can operate from home or from spaces that are more conducive for them, and that they don't have to be in the office. If they don't have to be in the office, the employer doesn't have to offer as much space in their office for the tenants that they have, or for the individuals that they have working for them. And in that way, there may want to be an entire renegotiation of the space that's going on, or the tenant is going to want to look to the future for holding less space because their employees can work remotely. And that's going to change all of the dynamics of rental in the city, I think, for years to come. One of the last points I want to make is bankruptcy considerations for both the landlord and the tenant. If the landlord is pushing too hard and eventually is going to push the tenant into bankruptcy, if they have forced payments out of the tenant, which are not in the ordinary course of business, they're not normal monthly payments, but they're catch up of late payments that have been there, those payments might be disgorged in a bankruptcy proceeding. For a tenant, the contemplation of a bankruptcy may be the best way to have some leverage with the landlord in terms of how they are going to be able to negotiate the best deal for themselves. For both sides, considering what the cost of filing a bankruptcy, either a Chapter 7 or a Chapter 11, that will then go to pay an attorney for that filing and go and pay the court fees for that filing, might better be spent on settling and negotiating a payment between the landlord and the tenant for the cure of the arrears, and seeing if the parties can move forward together. While the bankruptcy can be a sword, it can also be a shield, and it may be best that the parties look at how they can best negotiate with each other without having to threaten each other. I hope I've given you some ideas for the best ways of negotiating if the lease is going to be delinquent over the next few weeks, few months because of the shutdown. Know that there are strategies on both sides for dealing with getting through this. Thank you very much for listening. If you need more information, don't hesitate to go to the ISBA website and look for all of the offerings that have been made during this period of time. There are all sorts of webinars and short takes, quick takes like this. And I appreciate you listening to me today.